So Peter, thank you again for being here today, and Mark did a great job of recapping the different hats you wear on things, and journalist, author, professor, I think a few more we're leaving out there, but you bring a really interesting set of diverse perspectives to this, and I'd like to kind of start with just that level setting. Like how would you describe the current state of attritable autonomous systems and and their use, particularly in public sector missions?
So first, I want to thank the organizers, and also thank you for that kind introduction. I have to add, though, if you're trying to have the most interesting think tank report, it's not tough competition. So if you'll permit me, I'll begin with a story about when I first started writing on this field. I did a prior book called Wired for War that was a look at how in Afghanistan and Iraq we were starting to see unmanned systems begin to be used, that this technology from science fiction was becoming real, whether it was the small UGVs on the ground to starting to see some larger UAS, et cetera, and a couple of small UAS. But I remember two experiences that sort of give us a sense of where we were back then. First was I met with a US senator, and I literally had to kind of go back and forth with him and explain, no, I'm not making this up. There is no human inside, like the old, if you've ever heard of the Mechanical Turk, like, a little midget hiding inside the chess machine. I was like, no, it's not that way. They really are. We're moving into unmanned, remotely piloted, et cetera. So there was a awareness issue, a believability issue. The second was I gave a talk at US Air War College and talked about how we were going to see more and more of these technologies and that they would become more and more important, and they'd be taking on greater roles in everything from ISR to strike to transportation. I didn't say anything crazy like, it's only going to be unmanned systems in the future, or, it's going to end warfare. Nothing like that. Just said it's going to be a lot more important. And as what normally happens at the events, the commandant gets up on stage and he turns, and normally they thank you, and he turns to the audience and of these mid-career Air Force officers and says, don't listen to anything he just said. He's wrong. This is not the future. This is not the future of the Air Force. He made a couple of mistakes. The first, I was not an Air Force employee. Second, they'd left my mic on. So I then proceeded to tell him why he was wrong, and we had a nice little back and forth in front of all the mid-career students, and I was not invited back to the Air War College for 15 years. But to the point here, I think I won the argument. I've now am an adjunct professor at the Air War College. But secondly, I think this is clearly the present and the future, not the one, of this is the end of manned systems, but very clearly this is a technology that has proliferated across a wide variety of roles. It's grown in scale, it's grown in users, public sector, private sector. There's not a single conflict or type of organization where we're not seeing it present. But we're also, I think, only scratching the surface of, and I think you use that phrase as well, of where we're at, because in many ways the use has been early starter learning and often kind of ad hoc. And we've got some images to show you, and if you can bring up one, I'll end on this with, I think, the next slide there, if you could. I think in many ways is to sort of think about this parallel. That is an Italian pilot in 1911 in what is Libya. He's serving for the Kingdom of Italy in their war against the Ottoman Empire. That's the first aeroplane to be used in warfare. It went 45 miles per hour. He was able to do something not possible before, bring back ISR, real-time, rapid, et cetera. Secondly, after about a week of doing that, for whatever reason, he got bored and he took up with him a handful of explosives and dropped them out of the side of the plane. And so he conducted the first aerial strike, the first. So you can look at that, and again, I think about like parallels today. You can either say, well, it didn't end the war, or they kept using cannons, or et cetera, or you could look at it and go, something big is going on here. And we're going to see a lot more and more of it as people learn how to do it better, as other people copycat. And of course, you see rapid change from that.
And I mean, the journey from Wright brothers to where we are with unmanned systems, uncrewed systems, now in, 115 years is remarkable. You touched on, you weren't invited back for 15 years, which sort of gives a date for when that conversation was happening. What about the conversation with the senator? What's the time span we're talking about where this thinking has changed so dramatically?
I think that happened pretty rapidly because the technology on the large scale side, again, in kind of unplanned ways. And I was interested. I was talking to a group of U.S. military leaders yesterday, and I think this hits some larger conversations here. Is how do you drive change? How do you create change, particularly within bureaucracies that want to resist it, where every level there's a reason to say no. And the story that we've seen repeated in I don't know if we were losing my mic there. There we go. We've seen repeated in whether it's the story of small unmanned ground vehicles to what played out with UAS is once you get the use cases, even if it's not what was originally anticipated for it, once you get that demand from the field, and then secondly, it means that people can say this works, and often there's sort of a counterclaim of no, it doesn't work. This is the problem with it. It'll never do this. And that's the case whether it was with small UGVs, which were originally designed for things like exploring caves, and then they were deployed for EOD work, to what we've seen with UAS. Again, think of all the applications across ISR to now we're seeing them for delivery of anything from blood to medicine to if you're a criminal, drugs. If you're also the flip side of medicine, to of course utilizing delivery of explosives. So I think it's this combination of getting it out in the field. There's no denying that it exists. There's no denying that it works. And then you get this massive demand signal from the users. And that's where, again, and this is, I think, our colleagues in this room, it's often more of the demand is coming from like the combatant commands or the partners than it's coming from within the big bureaucracy, so to speak. And again, that's kind of to be expected, but that changes over time.
Yeah. And you sort of, pulled up a great historical parallel to, go back to this Italian pilot. The explosive tossed over the side may or may not have dramatically moved the needle. Aerial ISR was obviously a huge shift. Do you have kind of a high-level take on what the most transformative aspects are of the use of UAS? And let's stick to the battlefield use cases right now. Is it bigger, better ISR, or are there things that we should be thinking about differently?
So it's ISR, but it's how it feeds into the larger, and people will use lots of different descriptions of it. It's the kill chain, but that assumes that you're always using it for that aspect of strike. Let's flip it this way. Let's think about what's come out of Ukraine. We saw a state that had no space capability, very, very limited manned air force, and yet it has been able to use primarily UAS to do everything from, they played a key role in the stopping of the initial Russian invasion. While there was a lot of really cool videos of the initial strikes coming off of the Turkish version of the Predator, that was more about social media. The real role was the ISR for the artillery and missile strikes that proved so important to where we stand today, where there is not a unit, both the Ukrainian or a Russian unit, that doesn't go out supported by these technologies and opposed by these technologies. And that's also been part of the challenge for, and this I think is a big, it's a little bit of an onus on us as partners of Ukraine. We, in the training for the counteroffensive, trained them in best practices from early 2000s, 1990s. They were not ready for an adversary that also was using so many UAS and small UAS, and how they were able to sight for artillery, their artillery, to deployment of mines, you name it. You can have a similar discourse, and I think this is so crucial, about at sea. Ukraine, in effect, had a very small navy. Much of it had been either physically seized or sunk by the Russians in 2014 and in this one. The Russians hoped to be able to do things like have there's multiple times amphibious landings, hope to close off the Black Sea through the use of both unmanned surface vessels, again, small ones, not the big 2,000-3,000 ton ones, which the US Navy is still interested in, but also through UAS. They did everything from sink Russia's Black Sea flagship to about half their Black Sea's fleet has now been sunk either at sea or in harbors, and they've pushed them back hundreds of kilometers. And so again, it gave them a naval capability that they wouldn't have had before. But when I say naval, it's this combination, obviously, of air and sea assets. I think to make another historic parallel, we will look at, or are looking at, Ukraine as the equivalent of like the Spanish Civil War during the 1930s, where there was a great deal of, there was a competition between, a rise of fascism, and there was a question, are you going to aid local parties, volunteers, all that kind of discourse that I think there's a lot of parallels to Putin today. But the second is, it was obviously a test ground for a variety of technologies that had been introduced before into warfare, but now we saw them being used in greater numbers and being brought together in new approaches. Actually, if you could pull up another slide there, go into the next one. So it's a little bit like if you think, the Blitzkrieg, it was tested out in the Spanish Civil War, and it wasn't just about one technology, it was about how that technology was brought together into a new system of thinking. And I think we can see equivalents like that where we're getting a taste of it. And the worry is which states learn the lessons from it and which ones don't. So, it was all there in front of everyone's face in the mid-1930s, but the French and the Germans didn't learn the lessons of it. If you'll permit me, next slide. I think a big question that we're going to have to ask ourselves in terms of lessons is bigger always better? And this is the case whether you're thinking about manned or unmanned, at sea, in the air, on the ground, or if you're just thinking about coins. And to give a different historic example, you can see, we're supposed to be talking about the future, but I love talking about history because it gives us guides, it grounds us. If you can go to the next slide. Those are the, on the right is the German Tiger I tank. Big, heavily armed. It had one of the best kill ratios of World War II. But it was so expensive that the Germans could only manufacture 1,300 of them. On the left is the Sherman tank. It's we could go back and forth, but basically it wasn't as good as the Tiger by measures of like lethality, which was the buzzword in the Pentagon a couple years back. But we manufactured 51,000 of them. And so we have to ask ourselves today, do we want the Tiger or do we want the Sherman? And again, that's a question that every organization, whether you're a military, but frankly also if you're like a law enforcement or whatever, do I want the big, expensive, high quality, or do I want scale? And again, that's an open question, but there's a history to all this.
And I want to come back to that scale and many small, maybe not disposable, but certainly the loss is survivable in a minute. But I want to stick with ISR for a moment, because I think it's telling that was like the very first aerial military mission. And when you talked about what's going on in Ukraine, so much of this has been done with commercial off-the-shelf technology or kind of homebrew solutions that the Ukrainians have done. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that most of it's still happening with kind of the traditional ISR model. Single operator, single device, often but not always line of sight. And that's but that's sort of just the tip of the iceberg. I know from your writing and your other marks. Can you just talk about what's already possible to sort of do ISR in a different way, and maybe kind of putting on your useful fiction hat a little bit, what you see just over the horizon?
Sure. So if you're thinking about a task related to AI and robotics, a real key to it is figuring out not just the technology that I want, but the partnership between it and the human. Not to ruin the book for you, that's one of the underlying themes of Burn-In that they kindly provided to some folks. So, if you think like Moby Dick is not actually about a hunt for a whale, Burn-In is not, it's a hunt for a terrorist, but it's really about this question of what are the different types of potential partnership between human and machine. And if you're thinking about ISR, and ISR, again, we could be talking about ISR on the battlefield, we could be talking about ISR for law enforcement, we're going to be talking about ISR, I'm a farmer trying to figure out what's happening in my crops. Or we're thinking about another role. I'm thinking about medicine, I'm thinking about delivery, whatever it is. There's essentially 4 different relationships between human and our machines, our AI. One is it is a aid to us in some way, an advisor, a concierge. It suggests courses of action, whether it's what news you should read on your social media. If you're, Netflix, it's what movies you should watch. To literally, Netflix uses it to decide what movies to make and which actor should be in them. It's why Chris Pratt's in everything right now. But it's also, we're seeing, advice to where to deploy systems on a battlefield, or if you're doing border security. There's a second, which is related but different, where it's an extension of me. It extends my reach. Extends my reach if I'm a doctor doing remote surgery. Extends my reach if I'm sitting in Nevada flying a large UAS over Afghanistan. Third, related but different, is it's my partner, it's my wingman, it's my teammate. It's operating alongside me, whether I'm a police officer with a robotic dog right beside me, or I'm, the Air Force's plan for combat collaborative aircraft, I'm working in a factory or university lab. And again, to pause here, like you can see how you need very different human skills. It's not just about the machine I want, you need very different human skills, right? If how much training do you need to be if it's a partner or you're remotely operating it, et cetera. And then there's a fourth and final is it's an agent representing me. And that gets to the final part where if it's an agent out there representing me, it can then cooperate, collaborate, whatever verb you want to use, with other of my agents which then can create an agency of its own, which is like the idea of, in biology, the individual birds, but then a flock takes on kind of an agency of its own. Again, if you're Amazon thinking about delivery, or you're a police department thinking about how to use robotics, you essentially have to choose one of those pathways. You can't choose them all, because you would have wildly different training requirements for your people. You also would have wildly different robotic systems that you would want. And so, again, I think we're, and the decision that you make on which to choose is going to be guided by everything from the expense of the technology to what you're most comfortable with. Mm-hmm. Has the policy and law caught up to it yet?
Yeah. And I wonder if maybe you can tell a little bit of a story.
Here, let's take the German tank off the screen there to just be like, it's a little creepy for all of us.
It keeps rolling towards us throughout the conversation.
That's an even the spookier one. We can talk about that if you want.
By all means, go there, and then I'll come back to my question.
This is, one thing we have to understand with this is it's both about a capability that's been kind of staring us in the face for a while, but we've not been willing to look at, that both we can deploy, but bluntly also adversaries can deploy. And as was referenced, we have a project called Useful Fiction that basically it's the idea of taking some nonfiction research analysis, a white paper, a strategy paper, and sharing it through narrative. It's a little bit like a smoothie. So if a white paper is kale, it's hard to get people to consume it. Useful fiction is like take that kale, wrap it together, and the idea of narrative is not only are people, whether they're a senior leader or a mid-career, they're not only more likely to consume it, the science shows they're more likely to absorb it. And this is an example of a project we did for Australia that relates to small UAS. It's actually from 2 years back, pre-Ukraine, pre-Gaza, where they had their military had run some testing about it's basically discovering that both small UAS were offering their units more capability, but secondly, they had to think about adversaries and that their defenses were not set up for them. And the challenge was the AAR, the war game lessons weren't being listened to in other parts of the organization. So we took their AAR and we turned it into a short story, but also this artwork that kind of says it all. And if you're Australian, you'll look at it's a Hobart class. It's their most expensive warship, but it could shoot down ballistic missiles. It couldn't defend itself against small UAS. You can obviously think about parallels right now in whether it's off Yemen, Ukraine, to worries about. I was speaking with a general recently about large gatherings of people in the United States, like a stadium or something like that. And the point was you don't have to always the most expensive, exquisite threat isn't actually the one that maybe you should be worrying about the most.
And you were talking about the different paths and the different ways you can start to bring this technology in. And I'm wondering if maybe you can draw on an anecdote from burn-in to kind of help show what you're talking about. Because there's definitely the partner wingman approach there. I mean, unmanned systems are sort of ubiquitous throughout the book. But can you give maybe just a quick little vignette of one of the cases of police use, whether it's as the wingman or the agent in that?
Well, so what we did in the book, the first was to try and share what we thought people needed to know. So it's a novel, but it has 300 footnotes in the back.
I have never seen a novel with that many footnotes.
Well, that's the idea of useful fiction, and also so that people can, when they say, "Oh, that would never happen," or "That's not real," you're like, "Sorry, here's the footnote. It's either already happened." So with the small UAS strike, while Ukraine had not happened, Hezbollah had been using them already. So threats learn from each other, or it's here's someone has already put in they've already deployed this UAS to deliver drugs in Kenya. It's just we don't have, the FAA hasn't allowed us to do it here. But going back to that idea, when I was saying the 4 different pathways with our relationship with AI and robotics, each org, each task you need to choose, but different entities are going to make different choices for different roles. So there may be some roles where it's partner model, but you may have other roles where it's swarm model or remote operation model. And so what we, there's it's said in Washington, D.C. about 15 years from now, and I think we're not going out on a limb by talking about how you will see, as an example, and you've already seen, people going, there'll be deliveries happening by drones. Some of them will be small scale. I was just at Ole Miss University. While there's no small UAS delivering, the sidewalks are filled with the little small rolling robots. There's tons of them. I don't know how else and they're delivering Chick-fil-A everywhere. I mean, I'm supposedly a science fiction author, but like that scene, right? If you said like 15 years back, yeah, Ole Miss University, Chick-fil-A, there's going to be robots driving around. I mean, but that's where we're at right now. So I think we'll see commercial use more and more for a variety of tasks. Oh, by the way, while something's delivering, it can also be gathering ISR. And that's clearly in the plans of a lot of different corporations. Public sector use, whether it's public sector use for overall monitoring of traffic or emergency scenes to a tactical deployment, equivalent of a SWAT team. I want this to go in first before I've got people. Or it might be some more mundane or really important public sector thing like we have horrible infrastructure in the United States, so bridge inspections and the like. So in the same, think of what's going to be driving on the streets. Our projection is there'll be more cars that are more and more autonomous, but it's very clear that humans don't want to give up the wheel. And so we'll have some systems that don't have people, some systems where the person's riding behind it, ready to take over. And oh, by the way, all of this is, people are going to come up with their new uses, come up with trying to take advantage of things. So, we have a scene, I hate to tell you, but, so the opening scene is set outside Union Station. There's a delivery happening. There's someone flying in from Dulles. We've got the visions of air taxis. It's already happened in Dubai. Again, not with a trained pilot behind it. There's a police drone flying overhead. But guess what? There's still a traffic jam, even though there's some driverless vehicles, because the different companies behind driverless cars are not going to cooperate. And the different human drivers have figured out that you can edge in on a robotic system and it'll automatically stop before you hit it. So that's how you kind of force your way into traffic, which we all do right now, right? So that's the idea, is that you'll have this awesome future in some ways, but a lot of the annoying human stuff is going to still be with us.
Absolutely. And so Chick-fil-A delivery was probably not what you would have been predicting 15 years ago, but I'm curious, you've been thinking about this disruptive potential for like decades, not years. And what parts of this did you clearly see coming, and what maybe caught you most by surprise over the last 12 to 18 months?
So I think we, in both the nonfiction work and also the useful fiction side, I think we got correct the growing scale of the use, the growing advancement of it, the proliferation. I think the big key of we foresaw the lower barrier to entry that comes out of that. When it's cheaper, when it's easier to use, more and more organizations, people use it. I think we got oh, by the way, as I was referencing, it's not all going to be, easy and ice cream. There's going to be a lot of problems in our own use of it, policy questions, open law, how to figure out accountability, and obviously threat actors using it more and more. I think we got that right. The parts that, looking at like a Ukraine, I didn't get right, or I would have had a tougher time seeing. One is the incredibly rapid, not deployment, but iteration and adjustment. In the technology itself, the back and forth of it. The folks on the corporate side can speak to this. I mean, it'd be an interesting Q&A to ask them, how many upgrades, how many, changes in the software or the hardware have you made over the course of a year? I can't answer that for that. I can answer for, on the naval side, the Ukrainians' unmanned surface vessels, kind of the naval version of what we're talking about here. They've had 6 iterations in 1 year. And so, they changed everything from certain physical components to like allow it to, they upped the range by 200 kilometers, or to carry a different kind of strike package, or to carry a different kind of ISR, or to be more stealthy. But maybe even more important, and probably a parallel to the small US side, tons of software changes, basically to deal either with what was possible that hadn't been possible before, or to counter some kind of Russian counter. So, EW or GPS denial. And so they did, 6 iterations, and I'm sure there's been a lot if we're talking on other. I'd been used to the US system. Like, it was just, I couldn't imagine getting 6 generations out, and I'd been too ingrained in our acquisitions program. And I think it points to, a challenge for us. We're gonna have to systematically think about how to be able to do rapid iteration as a process. We're not even seeing that within there's a lot of really cool, test and experimental programs, but we're not seeing that kind of iteration that is happening out in the battlefield for a variety of different reasons. The second is, and actually you can go back a couple. So the one that shows the video of the drone flying. So if you go in reverse, one more, that one. Sorry, yeah. That we crossed a never ever moment, and there was nothing, there was not a big deal of it. So that we saw more and more armed UAS, but there was a moment of, we'll never ever see them autonomous and armed, and we've seen it. And it turned out not to be controversial, and I was really struck by that. And maybe it's because, it's our allies that did it, I don't know, but it's one, it was a never ever moment, but two, this was this thing that we thought would be a huge deal in the history of warfare. It happened, and you saw reporting in the lower, not in major media, and that really struck me.
Mm-hmm. And I want to pivot to the data side of things in just a moment. But before we leave Ukraine, are there any other kind of takeaways that you think warrant special emphasis? Because there's been a lot of coverage about the about the ISR, the targeting, the tactical strikes, but not really so much in the mainstream press about the strategic implications. Is there anything else you want to foot stomp on how the transformations that we're seeing in that conflict?
I think there's a lot of questions about one, how do we continue to support Ukraine best? And I'm worried about some things going on right now around that. That's pretty obvious, but we won't go into it. But second, what are we, but also what are adversaries learning from Ukraine? Mm-hmm. There is a lot of interesting lessons on how small democratic states can both defend themselves against aggressive authoritarian neighbors, and how can the rest of the world of democracies aid those small democratic states. And in particular, the goal is there is a failure in Ukraine. The failure is that we were not able to deter the invasion, right? So if we're thinking about, and I'm obviously making a reference to, if we're thinking about other states, it's the Baltics, it's a Taiwan. There's a project on the U.S. military side on, this concept of what does winning look like? Well, winning in the Pacific doesn't look like defeating, PLA forces on the beaches of Taiwan. Winning looks like the PLA each and every day deciding, it's just not a good day to go to war. And so I think there's a series of lessons of how can we aid these states in becoming such a thorny challenge. In many ways, so there's military people in the room, they're familiar with the idea of anti-access aerial denial. It's been how we've talked about the problem of China. They're creating these bubbles that we can't get into. It's actually, I think, we should embrace the sort of the opposite. We're the nations that don't want to change. We don't want to go out and seize territory. We like the static situation. So we're the ones that should be thinking about how can we best create anti-access aerial denial for our allies and for us. And one of the other, and so as part of this is to recognize that there's a variety of ways that we can aid both our forces, but also our allies, but also to understand that a number of these allies do not have the same budgets that we do. So there are certain capabilities and systems that are great, but we can't go to a small partner state and say, you ought to buy this. And it may even do them a disservice. And even if it will drive down the per unit price for us, it may not help us strategically. So kind of coming out of Ukraine, I think this question of how can we aid better in creating bubbles around them that are anti-access aerial denials, and referencing back to what's happened in Ukraine is they don't have a massive air force, they don't have a massive navy, their army has been hard pressed, and yet they've held their own quite well against the second best adversary nation for us. So how can we model on that? How can we learn it?
And I know I've seen a couple questions come in from our virtual audience that'll let us come back to some of that denial and the sort of counter UAS strategies. We'll get to that in a few minutes. The data side, when you talk about, stay with Ukraine for a moment, the kind of jury-rigged situational awareness solutions that the Ukrainian forces have put together to share and disseminate, like the data that's coming from these systems is pretty remarkable. And but when you talk about the footage that drones can capture, or certainly when you get to situations like in your writing, where there are there's the delivery bots, there's targeted individual aerial systems, there are sort of autonomous flocks out there monitoring. On the one hand, there's potentially a level of ISR and situational awareness that's never been possible before, but it comes through very loud and clear in the book that that fire hose is really hard to deal with. And you talked about how do humans work with these systems in a better way. I'm just curious, can you talk about that data overload challenge and what happens as these streams begin to multiply?
Yeah, so a lot of different ways to think about that. What we were trying to project in the book is that one of the opportunity of getting more data that's often sold to us isn't the bucket of gold at the end. It actually creates a different set of challenges, and it's a set of challenges whether you are in the book a law enforcement. There's so much now data coming at you, and you can it's everything from I can be overwhelmed by that data, or I can fall into the mistake of becoming consumed with focusing on one flow of data, and there's the other flows of data out there, to there's issues of should I trust the different types and sources of data. Which one is more important than another? And again, I just described a situation for, we paint a scene of a law enforcement officer entering Union Station, and you've got all the data kind of coming at them. But oh, by the way, it's the same thing, which is starting to play out as you go into a grocery store. And that's, wait till, Apple and you wearing your goggles and, everything coming at you. Oh, by the way, it's your social relationships. I think most of our kids face a data overload problem right now. It's the same on the battlefield. So you've got that phenomena. I think another, and to go back to that story of the argument with the Air Force general, I think what you're putting your finger on, and this is what I was arguing back then, it leads more and more organizations to go further and further down that model from remote operation to more autonomy. Because one of the old arguments against unmanned systems was actually personnel problems. And I remember, they'd say, well, for every combat air patrol with a large UAS, I need, and the number was 68 people behind it, 68 analysts to sift through all the information, to fly it, et cetera. And so you'd get this kind of like, I'd love to buy them, but I can't afford them because of the people costs. And that was very obviously a dodge, because it was like, that's the problem is your model of one system to 68 people behind it. Instead, let's get to a model of 1-to-1, or even better,
1-to-68,
many to one. And that's where we're headed. And that's the same phenomena if you're a delivery company. So I think it sends you down that. The difference for the civilian, private industry, or public sector use is there's an adversary most likely to go after your comms. And that, again, I think drives you down the autonomy direction more. Any thinking adversary, and again, we could predict this, and it happened, is if they're looking at someone operating, off a string, you can either hit the system or I can cut the string. And I can cut the string either through EW, or I can take away access to something that it needs, GPS. It's a very obvious response. We kind of kidded ourselves that it wouldn't happen, and it's happened. But what my point is, there used to be these arguments. Well, but what if they do jamming? And the answer is, well, we do counter, and I make it more able to operate on its own. I can go back to the way we did things in the 1990s, which is your choice. And so again, I think having an adversary drives you more down that pathway of more autonomy. I will add the one I'm sort of thinking through it in front of you. There will be kind of an adversarial problem of bandwidth on the civilian side, where it may not be I'm being actively jammed, or the Russians are taking away my GPS. It may just be going back to creaky U.S. infrastructure. Do I have enough bandwidth to operate my system?
If you're Border Patrol or Forest Service, it's...
Well, there's either I don't have access, or there's so many other people going around, they're sort of sucking up my use of bandwidth. Again, you can either say, I'm not going to get the advantages of the technology because I'm worried about this, or I'm going to have it on fail mode, or I can say, I want a system that can still operate if it doesn't have access to bandwidth.
And I'm actually going to go to a question from the virtual audience that popped in literally as you were talking about that, about this question of how UAS systems can be operated in denied areas where traditional communications are being degraded or denied. I mean, what I heard you say is that more autonomy, it may not be the entire answer, but it's a huge part of it.
So there's basically think about roughly you have to deal with either upgrades on the sensor side and or the autonomy, the software side. So the sensor side, can it gain information about the environment around it in a way that is different from what is being denied to it? So can it operate visually? Can it, there's a lot of really cool things going on in quantum and the light, and so, and again, how is it, if I've cut that cord, can it gather information about the world around it on its own in an alternative way, and/or can it react and operate independently based on that information? And that's much of what we're seeing right now. There's also a separate thing. Again, I don't think the civilian systems have to worry about this, but there is on the military and maybe some law enforcement. There's also, not just EW jamming. I'm going after the signal. There's some, I want to just literally overwhelm the software, fry it in a non, in a layman's term. So there's hardening that you may need as well. And again, but the most is this is going to be, it's a constant back and forth, back and forth. I mean, you even see this with, jamming. Jamming's not, you can either jam everything, but if you jam everything, go back to how I said, the Russians and the Ukrainians are using them. If you jam everything, you're taking away your own system, so that's that kind of back and forth. Or I'm jamming certain things, well, my counter to that is to hop frequencies or whatever, right? Or I don't have GPS, fine. I have recognized waypoints. Or the lethal autonomy. I've got it preloaded with, this is what a Russian tank looks like. Go get it.
Good. So you mentioned earlier that one of the questions we did ask is bigger always better? And I think it's pretty obvious from from your tone and a couple of references that it's the answer is certainly not always, and maybe not even all that often anymore. That's one of the premises of DoD's replicator effort right now. It's small, many, smart, a few other adjectives we could throw in there. But I'm interested in your high-level take on that effort. Is it asking the right questions, and is it really is it influencing what's happening on the ground? Is not the right framing of it, but what's actually happening out at the mission edge yet?
Yeah. So I need to be clear on the kind of the casting doubt on is bigger or better. What I'm concerned about is the reasons for the choices that we are making with, so at one point it was a man versus unmanned discourse. Now it's okay, and again, whether it's Navy, Air Force, Army, it's okay, we remember when we didn't want them, we want them, but now it's this pathway of I worry that we're choosing the types that we're most comfortable with, that most, oddly enough, that cause the least disruption to our current organization, our current acquisition system, our current military culture. It's a lot easier to, if I'm gonna use UAS, it's a lot easier to say, well, it's gonna be flying alongside my F-35. And it's, don't worry, pilots, squadron model stays the same, to don't worry, it really doesn't change industry, what you supply me. Or if you're, we're using air models, we got some Army folks right there. If I'm thinking about robotics, ground vehicles, well, if it's the size, shape, form of a tank, if that's less disruptive. I mean, one of the fascinating things I find is the Army is willing to envision robotic tanks, but to the military culture side, it's not willing to envision a change in the number of people in an infantry squad. That's where we're at right now, right? And we could have the same, Navy, 3,000 ton, basically the size of a World War II destroyer. And so I'm concerned, are we making the choice because of who we are right now? Going back to that example of the Blitzkrieg, the British are the ones who invented the tank. The British then, in the 1920s and early 30s, did all the smart things that we're doing right now in terms of testing. They had, it's called the Experimental Mechanized Force. They're the ones who figured out the concept of the Blitzkrieg. But they chose not to adopt it because of their own military culture. If you go back and read the diaries of the ages, basically it was the model of the best ways of using tanks was a threat to the regimental system. And the regimental system for Brits is like, it's not just a unit, it's like your culture. Your grandfather's grandfather was in that regiment. And so they ultimately decide regiment matters more than optimal military output. What are we doing now? And again, that's my concern on the bigger, smaller. You had another question. I went on a total. No. What was the last one?
It was just of whether the conversation the replicator's doing is like framing the right conversation.
So I'm a fan of Replicator. I love the vision that Kath Hicks and her team have put out there of saying, one of the lessons coming out of Ukraine, et cetera, is this, let's put some energy, it's a leadership vision. So very, very positive on it. I think the two challenges for Replicator, one, how much money is on the table? And it's still not clear to me, and I think industry at the end of the day is going to make a decision, is Replicator a $2 billion? Is it a $20 billion? Is it a 70 or whatever? And so if I'm on the industry side, I can either make a bet hoping it's going to be of some scale, or most industry is going to wait till I get a sense of the scale to pivot towards it. And that's reasonable enough. And then the second is, how do we take Replicator and lash it up to more and more use in the field, like a Ukraine? Remember, I was talking with not someone from this company, but another company, and they were saying, basically, Ukraine's the ultimate marketplace right now for selling to the US military. And it's both because if the Ukrainians like it, it validates it. Secondly, it's like, I'm a big NBA fan. It's like the doubts about the Cleveland Cavaliers right now have a great win-loss record, but no one trusts them because they did poorly in the playoffs. No one's going to trust them until they're in the playoffs again and they succeed. It's the same thing. Operating against Russia means it's not only working, but it's working against an adversary that's trying hard against it. So one, how can we lash up more of the Replicator initiatives, either to use out in Ukraine or to the experimental tests that are going on, operationalizing it, that then gets it over that kind of valley of death by the users in the field, the theater commanders, et cetera, coming back and saying, I really, really liked it. I really found use of it. The parallel of, if you're a Navy person, Task Force 59, which was in the Middle East, and basically gained thousands of hours of experience with small unmanned surface vessels and unmanned aerial systems, and by getting the thousands of hours of experience in the field, it one, served as a proof case. Two, what was really neat about it is we began to discover new approaches with it that even the companies had not planned for. It also worked out a lot of the adversarial problems. We figured, to your autonomy and ISR thing, the Iranians kidnapped a couple of our systems, and it actually proved really useful that they did that, because it led to everything from how do we figure out our policy around when someone kidnaps it, to how do we track the system to make sure that we know when it's being kidnapped. The first kidnapping of the naval drones, the only way they figured out that it was happening was they were sail drones, and then a human, not a system, very smartly noticed that the drones were going against the wind. And it was because the Iranians had lashed it on the top of a freighter and were towing it away. That was the only indicator that we got that someone was stealing our drone. And then learn from that. Okay, yeah.
Eventually program the escape and evasion algorithms, and we'll be good to go. So, as someone who spent the bulk of my career as a writer and then by avocation has always been a tech nerd, I'm fascinated by the useful fiction initiative that you're doing and how you work with a range of government organizations to kind of, crystal ball's not the right way, but to really to think, to think a little bit over the horizon on things. I want you just talk a little bit about that work, like, I mean, how you came to that model, and maybe a couple examples of where you're helping organizations explore what comes next.
Sure. So the origin point for it was a book that August Cole and I did called Ghost Fleet. And Ghost Fleet, August was a defense reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I is referenced in a lot of different work on nonfiction technology, working with the military. At the time, though, we were frustrated by two things. One, this was back in 2012-ish period. All the focus within the national security community was on counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. This was going to be the future. And similarly, the discourse around China was, well, we can embrace them to be, in the terminology of the age, was a responsible international partner. And we just didn't buy that. Historically, out of the 10 times there have been great powers rising, 9 times competition and conflict ensued. The only time it didn't happen was UK to US, and that was because the UK was concerned about another great power rising, which was the Germans. And so we said, we think there's going to be, and it sounds silly to say it because it's now on everybody's mind, we were like, we think great power competition is going to come back, maybe even conflict. But secondly, there's all these new technologies, drones, cyber, supply chain security issues, that mean that this will be different than the way we thought about competition and conflict with the Soviet Union. And so we decided the best way to share that was through this idea of smashing up novel and nonfiction. And it obviously sold well, but what a lot of folks don't know is it turned out to be the most influential work of our careers. Got to everything from brief its real world lessons to the president, the Joint Chiefs in the tank, 6 testimonies to Congress. But it wasn't just that. It actually changed policies in ways that doesn't often happen. And you made a joke about think tank land before. There were 3 US government investigations launched to keep things that we had in our book from ever coming true. So if you're in the intelligence game, the goal is often not to predict the future, it's to prevent a future. So you would rather prevent Pearl Harbor than predict Pearl Harbor. There's a bunch of things that came true because of the book. And so it was a great experience. And so coming out of that, we figured out that this smoothie model could work with partners. And as was referenced, we've done a variety of projects with governments around the world. Obviously enough, this technology area features a great deal for 2 reasons. And I think it's important and maybe and helps bring a capstone to this conversation. One is what we've been talking about. It's very obviously a technology that's being used in war. It's a technology of the present. It's a technology of the future, however you want to frame it, right? But the second is the explainability problem. Pretty much every organization and people who are using these technologies are trying to figure out, how do I tell the story of it? How do I tell the story of its possibilities and application for my enterprise or for my problem? Or it might be the flip side, how to tell the story of the threat that emanates from this new area. How do I get people to pay attention? How do I break through? And so that's why I think so many of our projects keep coming back to unmanned systems. It's not just because, Peter knows something about it. It's not just because it's a cool new tech area. I think a challenge that we all have to kind of collectively wrestle with is it's a tech area that still has a narrative issue. and it still needs to, it still faces the problem of how does it best tell its story, and that's why I think we're often working with partners on it.
Good. Well, I have more questions, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I know we've got a long list from online, and I've seen people sort of starting to gesture that they're interested. So let's open it up to the audience, and Walker has the microphone. So let's start here in the room. If there are folks that have questions for Peter. Yeah, just they'll turn it on. You're good.
They got it? All right, thank you. So first, thanks for speaking. Missing National Guard Bureau Army side UAS lead. With the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, we see that Russia is changing their doctrine based off of the lessons learned with unmanned aircraft. Right now, they're looking at RAS platoons and stuff. Have you noticed a change in whether it's our peer and near-peer adversaries or even our allies, a change in doctrine as far as the way that they're operating? And on a second note, since you're at the War College, are you seeing us starting to implement that into our exercises as well? Since we look at how our adversaries, their doctrine and how they use them, are we starting to implement that in the way that we're doing our war fighters and other exercises? Thank you.
Great question. I think it depends on the service and even kind of the parts, communities in the service. And that is obviously a problem for doctrine, because ideally our doctrine is joint because of the kind of the multi-domain aspects of it. And secondly, it's not great if, whatever, the tanker community is making a change, but the artillery community is not, et cetera, right? But so my answer is service dependent, even community dependent, but for the most part, if I'm to make a characterization, I think we are modulating our doctrine, but not changing our doctrine. And that parallels this kind of discourse of, well, but artillery still matters. Yeah, and you could have said this. I imagine like people talking about this in, 1917 as the tanks are coming out, and someone's like, yeah, but there's still trenches and there's still artillery, and you're like, yes, no one's not saying that, but this tank thing kind of matters. And oh, by the way, the mobility means you have new doctrinal possibilities, et cetera, right? And I think we're stuck in our discourse on that in the narrative world and the doctrinal world. I see more and more UAS in various exercises for the US, but bluntly, it's still in the onesies and twosies, or the fivesies and tensies. It's not in the, if we're thinking about the threat side. Okay, how do I deal with 1,000 coming at me, as opposed to like one flying over my command post and making things really, really tough already, right? Or the individual, y'all have probably seen the videos, individual Russian soldiers being targeted by UAS. Oh, by the way, back to your ISR thing, I should have mentioned it. And this is another part. How have we figured out how to bring in all that information, including open source information? The info overload issue for the Ukrainians is it's not just what they're gathering through official, it's also, they report they're getting around 10,000 different items of information every single day that are being provided to them, everything from commercial UAS to someone's social media feed, and it's providing strategic awareness, but it's also, they're using that to hit an individual Russian soldier in one foxhole. I don't know if we've made that kind of change in both how we bring in information, but also if we think about the threat side. I think it's been a lot of modulation, and again, I worry because clearly other threat actors, there's a huge initiative within the PLA to learn the lessons from Ukraine. Like any other military, I did an article on this about a year back, looking at some of the PLA learning in their own where they've talked about it. Like any other military, some parts of it are great, the reforms that we already were doing are perfect for what we need to see. And you see a lot of that out of the US military too. So for one example, which is it's a smart learning on there, it's not good for us. They basically said one of the key failures of the Russians was unrealistic training, and another was they don't have a good NCO core. And then the PLA said, but fortunately, we've been trying to get a better NCO core, and our training's getting more and more realistic. Pat on the back. The other lesson that's a really interesting one that the PLA took from Ukraine is they think the Russians went too easy with their fires. They're just not shooting enough stuff at the Ukrainians. And the reason is the Russians, there was two reasons. One, the Russians, for the early part of the conflict, thought they would take over Ukraine, so they were not flattening parts of it because they thought they would be the rulers soon. And then now they don't have enough. The PLA has basically said, Russians, you're going too easy. Why are you only firing 2 missiles? Why are you only sending 2 drones over there? It ought to be 100. So it's sort of this funny / scary that the PLA looks at what the Russians are doing and saying, you're just taking it easy on the Ukrainians. Why don't you do more?
And that answer and how to deal with the scale and moving from onesie twosies to 100 or 1,000 goes to a question from one of our online viewers, which is, when it comes to autonomy and swarming, or these mass deployments, what do you assess as the most dangerous future capability there? Is it just the sheer numbers, or do we need to think about it in a different way?
I think it's the sheer numbers. And to give a different example of it, what played out for Israel on October 7th. Israel had literally decades of warning related to not just overall Hamas threats, but threats from small UAS. As I referenced, the first use of it was by Hezbollah in 2004. So if anyone should have been aware of it, it was them. On that day, among many things that played out, they were overwhelmed by numbers of people, but also overwhelmed by numbers of small UAS. And basically it's because Hamas knows basic math. They knew exactly how many Iron Dome could take down, and they sent more. The PLA also knows basic math. And so the challenge is either you get overwhelmed and it gets through and strikes you, or you go, what they call, you go Winchester. I empty my magazines and trying to defend them, and then I've got to get out before they get me. And for a China scenario, so let's use an example of going back to that example of like a Aegis class warship, one of our premier systems. Let's say it has 100% success rate firing off its missiles against incoming aerial threats, which is not going to happen, but let's just say it does. It still goes empty magazines, and it can't be reloaded unless it really goes back to Hawaii, which gives, even if they don't sink it, which would be the worst case for us, it still gives the adversary this window in which they get the equivalent of air or naval superiority. And take that example of a multi-billion-dollar warship, and I think you could replicate it for a brigade combat team or whatever. So the sheer number issue, I think, worries me a great deal.
Great. Other questions in the room for Peter? Yes, sir. We'll bring the mic. Back to you. Thank you.
Hi, Peter. Creighton from ADS. We're a channel partner with Skydio. My question is, or my thesis is, that 30 years ago, the DoD, the U.S. government, was a net exporter of technology, right? The heads-up display probably somebody has in their car here, to graphical user interface, right, which we now all take for granted on our phones or on our computers. Those are government inventions, and now that's flipped, right? Skydio was invested by private money and still owned by private equity, owned by the shareholders. And they're developing new technology on their own dime. What does that mean for the future of not just conflict, but for technology?
Wow, big one. So there's, again, like everything, there's positives and negatives. I think the positive is the discourse around innovation, the flexibility, we see examples of this all over, where private industry is able to move quicker than government. And it's not to beat up on government. I'm a taxpayer. I don't want government in certain areas to be too risky. I want that private industry to take the risk if they want to get the reward from it. The proliferation of multiple different approaches that happens across private industry rather than a single winner-take-all model, which is what so many of government acquisition programs. So there's that benefit of innovation. There's two flip sides to be concerned about. One is industry, for good reason, has to be responsible to the owners and shareholders. So they are going to chase areas that are best for the return. And if the military has not caught up to it or isn't headed in that direction, it may not be where they invest. So if and I'm in private industry and I have to choose between X and Y, if X is more profitable for me or shows a bigger growth payoff, and that's a particular issue for working with the DoD. Is this going to be something that has that exponential curve up, or is it like that? The most VCs don't want a dividend-paying model, right? They want that rapid curve, and/or the time frame, the level of patience in a lot of the VC investor world. I want to see my returns on my investment within 3 years, 5 years, maybe, if I'm really, really patient. It's tough to say, well, I'm going to wait and go back to my story. Like, you could see the trends happening in 2005, but it isn't until Ukraine comes along that you get the test case that jumps it forward, right? It's tough to have that kind of patience. The other challenge, and now I'm going to be controversial, is private industry. It depends on the owners, and some owners can be really mercurial, is my kind way of saying it. And you can have industry will decide what to do based on what's best for it. If it is a company that is, for example, dependent on large amounts of business with China, I'll throw it out there more directly. I just did an article on satellite-provided internet. We have a duality happening right now, which is a science fiction author. It sounds, I wouldn't get away with making it up. But on one hand, we have China putting up its own satellite-enabled network. It just had a series of launches. It plans to go operational kind of into 24, mid-25, so the Chinese version of Starlink. And then simultaneous to that, we have a system that we and our allies are highly reliant on, where it's owned by someone whose entire personal fortune is wrapped up within the CCP, both in terms of if the production of his systems, and it's the most profitable marketplace for his sales, and someone who has been incredibly combative with pretty much everyone online except the CCP. Go check out his tweets or X's about them. And someone who has intervened on multiple occasions to keep the Ukrainians from utilizing access to the system in certain locations, including he took away, there was an opportunity to sink most of the Russian Black Sea's fleet. If you're a naval historian, We could have had the drone version of the Battle of Toronto, and Elon took it away from us just by taking away access for Starlink to, you may have seen in the news, it turns out that not just for Starlink, but for Starshield, the US system, allegedly, according to US congressmen, service members in Taiwan are not able to access it. That sounds like fiction. That comes out of reliance on the appeal of private industry is I have a vibrant marketplace. If you are reliant on one actor, you better be really, really, really certain of that actor.
So there's I think a really interesting question that came from the virtual audience, especially because it came from someone in the Air Force, and it kind of builds on what you were just saying. They were asking, what is the biggest threat to the UAS industry? And I mean, you mentioned maybe some self-inflicted wounds is one of the risks, but what are the other risks you think we need to be monitoring and mitigating?
Wow, that'd be a better question to ask, like our, the other folks, kind of, what are your big challenges? I think it's probably, some of the things that we've referenced before. It's, unlocking appropriate, in the absence of regulation and/or too much regulation, it's created, back to the kind of the question around industry, am I willing to make that big bet? Can I scale? What does the marketplace actually look like on the civilian use side? We've got a variety of examples that we know can be done, but if I'm on the industry side, I want to be able to say, it's not just being used by this one, insert name here, police department, agricultural corporation, fire and rescue, whatever. I want it to be scaled across hundreds or thousands of them. Same thing for not just one National Guard unit test program. I need to scale it. And we are still in the United States to work through a lot of the issues surrounding that, and for good reason. But I think there's that regulatory challenge that's holding back the industry. That I think you can kind of feel in the air this sense of like, but once it happens, like that. The other is, again, parallel to what a phone maker faces to whatever is back to the China issue. How much of the story, and again, there's people in this room who are far more expert than I. One of the challenges for the small U.S. market overall globally was there was major Chinese manufacturing. We can have a discussion around the civil-military fusion model and are they truly independent, et cetera, but basically it's a marketplace where you are in competition with a authoritarian state that's been a major producer of these systems. And again, that goes back to like, if we're thinking about supply chain vulnerabilities for us at home to, the Ukrainians, they've had to navigate this actively, like for a while they were using Chinese-made systems and then like, hold it, what about the software to what about my access? So that to me would be the two biggest challenges. Okay. Yeah.
Very good. And we are coming up on time, but I want to make sure that we do get in as many questions as we can. So a last call for questions in the room for Peter. And yeah, Mark.
Hi, I'm Steve Lowther with the U.S. Army Test Center in Aberdeen, Maryland. And I head up the UAS and data visualization teams. And one of the things that we're always looking for is how do we distribute the digital twins that we're developing from our UAS systems, and how you might see that technology moving forward to get that info to the stakeholder.
The two issues that I would throw out on that, and you're probably aware of, and we already talked about one, which is the data overload problem, and all the and again, there's actually a great amount of research within the civilian consumer market side about both how to help with overload and sometimes to like take advantage of it based on who we are as humans. the fact that the alert, like on social media where it's you have a message and it's in red is not because of happenstance. It's because they want time on platform. So first is we talked about data overload. The second is to understand the timeline between our/your research and development and deployment of the system to the end user, and what that end user will expect as the norm. To put it a different way, the first wave of a lot of these systems, there was this, first there was kind of the bulky DoD yuck version, and then there was this, well, let's copy Xbox, let's copy video game platforms. And there's a generation of kids now that are like, what is this old stuff? That we're like, oh, but it's cool, video game-like. It's video game-like when I was a kid, right? And so keeping a pace with what is the user interface that the member of the military has already been trained up on. That was the appeal of using the old kind of joystick Xbox model. It was this idea that Sony and others already did all the training for them. They walked in and unlike, needing to figure out how to operate an M16, you put it in their hand and they could figure it out within seconds. It's not that way anymore because we're giving them gear too often that's like old school video game model. So keeping a pace with that is the other, because of just the long, the timeline between when our research, when it gets out in the field, we have to stay with where private industry is headed with interfaces rather than thinking we're cool and cutting edge by having something that's dated.
And I know you have a plane to catch. I promise we'll let you go here in a minute. But there's one other question I want to ask because I think it will feed nicely into the next panel. And it was one of our online viewers was asking about going back to the counter UAS questions and sort of you talked a little bit about how you see it developing as an important military consideration, but if you could talk just a little bit more about that. And then I think the interesting part of the question is, how does sUAS come into play when you're talking about non-military missions? So whether it's stadium security or maybe it's not counter, but dealing with those bandwidth issues that you checked. What do the non-battlefield mission owners need to be thinking about in this space?
So I think it does have some parallels to what we talked about in terms of if we're thinking about defending a military unit against UAS right now. The first is to understand the problem of scale. The barrier to entry is getting lower and lower, both because of the cost of the system. So it's easy for a threat actor, be it a state, a non-state actor, an individual, to gain it. Back to what he was bringing in, the skill level to utilize it. I don't have to be an expert bomb maker to deploy a small UAS. Right. The second is to understand that the threat is diverse. Not every scenario is someone flying a bomb in, which again, so it's harder to get the bomb than it is to get the small UAS right now. It may be it causes damage just by kinetic. I fly it through a window of a prominent leader, individual. I fly it into a crowd. I don't kill hundreds, but I cause some major problems. Or it may be there's an ISR issue for the adversary using it, gaining understanding of the threat. So don't just think about it as terms of a IED model. There's other threats that are out there. The other part is to understand our counters to it, range from same thing for us, EW, cyber, taking away access to bandwidth, kinetic kill, or even better, getting earlier in the cycle to understand where they're there. But again, it's a little bit, I think the difference on the civilian side for the counter UAS threat is we don't want to kill all the possibilities by only worrying about the threat side of it. So to give an example, we thought this was going to be a talk about the future. I'm going to mention the Ottoman Empire twice. The first car bomb was used to go after the Ottoman Sultan. That's how long there's been that threat of car bombs. The reaction could have been, well, ban all cars. We figured out how to have a world with cars and also bad guys maybe using them for bad things. That's the same thing we're going to have to figure out related to these technologies. So, yes, there's definite threats we need to be aware of, scale, et cetera. But if we only focus on the threat side, we're taking away all the possibilities that we talked about of using them across pretty much every part of a commercial enterprise or public sector.
Very good. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. But Peter, it's been a great conversation. Please join me in thanking Peter Singer for being here.